Chapter 5. The Human. Hugo dropped to the ground. He didn't move a muscle. That was what Mrs. Nuckluck had taught all her students to do in an emergency like this one. All the other squidges had dropped to the ground too. They kept perfectly still as only a Sasquatch can. If you didn't know any better, you would have thought the squidges were mounds of muck and leaves. Hugo listened hard for the sound of a human approaching. At first all he could hear was the gurgle and splish of Rippleworm River, which was at the end of the meadow, just past the 5 hemlock trees. Suddenly, though, he heard footsteps. They were not noisy footsteps, but they weren't quiet either. Closer and closer they came. Hugo knew he was supposed to squeeze his eyes shut, but he also did not want to miss his first glimpse of a real human. His heart was pounding in his chest, and his stomach felt queasy with excitement and fear. Suddenly, there was a rustle to the left of him. From behind the closest hemlock tree, it appeared, a real, live human.
Whiff.
Sorry. The human walked slowly, looking around as if it expected to see something interesting. Hugo was surprised at how small it was. Not much bigger than a Sasquatch toddler. And though Hugo expected to be terrified at the sight of the human, he found he wasn't scared at all. Hugo watched as the human bent down and plucked up a dandelion puff. The human closed its eyes for a moment, puckered up its lips, and blew. The dandelion puff broke apart and floated off in the wind. It was such a strange thing to do, and the human looked so funny, with no hair on its body except for a mussy tuft on top of its head, that Hugo laughed. The human looked right at him. Hugo's eyes went wide. So did the human's. For a moment they were both frozen, staring at each other. The very next moment rocks began to fly at the human. Hugo knew it was Mrs. Nuckluck throwing the rocks, but she was so well hidden that it looked like the rocks were flying out of thin air. The rocks came close to the human without actually hitting it, but that was enough to scare it. The human turned and ran without looking back. Chapter 6. Dead Porcupines. Once they were all safely back in the cavern, Sorry about that. We'll try again. Once they were all safely back in the cavern, Mrs. Nuckluck turned to Hugo. She was furious. In all my years of teaching, said Mrs. Nuckluck, not one of my students has ever been spotted by a human until today, and certainly none of them has laughed at the sight of one. She was so mad that even the feathers on her long cloak were all puffed up, just like those of an angry goose. What were you thinking, Hugo? I was thinking, said Hugo in a smallish voice. I was thinking that the human was funny looking. There is nothing funny about humans, Mrs. Nuckluck snapped. You might have been captured, or worse. I'll be sending a note home to your parents, Hugo. You can be sure of that. Mrs. Nuckluck took a deep breath and smoothed down the feathers on her cloak. Now, everyone, go wash that mud off. The class headed over to the underground pool just beside the classroom. All the squidges were splashing and playing in the cold spring water. They were all having fun except for Hugo. He was crushed. He'd never had a note sent home to his parents before. What did the human look like up close? Pip asked Hugo excitedly as she rubbed mud from the hair on her arms. Did it have glowing red eyes? That's just a myth, Gigi said. Its eyes were brown, said Hugo, like ours. And did it smell like dead porcupines? Asked Malcolm. I heard humans stink. Hugo shook his head. No, it smelled. Hugo tried to remember the human smell, but couldn't. Hugo dunked his head under water and scrubbed the mud out of his ears. When he popped his head back up, he remembered something. Gigi, he said, I saw the human do something strange. It plucked a dandelion puff, closed its eyes, and blew on it so all the little seeds blew away. Why would it do that? Oh, that's easy, said Gigi. It was making a wish. I read about that once in a book. Humans blow on the dandelion so that the wish blows off into the big wide world and can come true. Oh, Hugo nodded. After a minute he asked, "Does it work?" "It must," Gigi said thoughtfully. "Or else, why would they keep doing it?"